October 25th, 1854. The time is just past dawn, moving toward 8 o'clock. A thick, cold fog clings to the valley floor, a sluggish, grey sea blanketing the scrubland of the Crimean Peninsula. It is a ghostly shroud, smelling of damp earth, wood smoke, and the metallic tang of fear. You are standing on a low ridge, your hands raw and red, chafed from the cold and the rough wood of your rifle. The wool of your calilt, the dark Sutherland tartan, is heavy and damp, and the tall black ostrich feathers on your bonnet drip with the clinging mist. Beside you, shoulder to shoulder, are 550 men. They are the 93rd Sutherland Highlanders. You know their faces. You know the man from Skye who coughs nervously beside you, the lad from Glasgow who whispers a line from a psalm. You can hear the jangle of a bayonet sheath, the metallic click of a percussion cap being checked, the low, steady, almost conversational voice of an officer. Hold the line, lads. Steady. Let the smoke clear. The fog muffles the world, creating a frightening, claustrophobic intimacy. Your world has shrunk to the man on your left and the man on your right. But then, through the fog, comes another sound. At first, it is a whisper, a vibration felt more in the soles of your boots and the pit of your stomach than heard with your ears. It is the sound of the earth itself complaining, a deep, rhythmic thrumming. It grows, resolving into a dull, rolling thunder that seems to come from everywhere at once. It is the sound of hooves. Not a squadron, not a regiment. It is the sound of an army of horses. The fog, as if disturbed by the sound, begins to tear. It parts like a vast grey curtain, and through the gaps you see them. It is a sea of men and horses, a dark, glittering mass of them stretching across the valley, so wide you cannot see its flanks. They are not a rabble. They are a disciplined, terrible wave of power, cresting the nearby causeway heights. You see the glint of sunlight on polished helmets, the forest of lances held upright, the stark green and blue uniforms of hussars, the fur caps of Cossacks. They are the combined might of the Russian cavalry, fresh and furious, and they are surging forward. Their objective is the cluster of tents, ships, masts, and chaos behind you. The tiny, choking port of Balaclava. This is the windpipe of the entire British army, and between this charging sea of 3,000 horsemen and the survival of an empire, there is only you. There is only this single, impossibly fragile, two-man-deep line of red-coated infantry. What happens in the next 10 minutes should not be possible. It will defy a century of established military doctrine. It will be witnessed by a journalist watching, horrified, from the cliffs above, his quill pen scratching in his notebook, coining a phrase that will enter the English language forever. It is a moment of absurd, almost suicidal courage, a moment made possible by a revolution in technology, and a moment that exists only because of the staggering incompetence that defined one of history's most pointless wars. This is the story of the 550 Scottish soldiers who faced 3,000 Russian cavalry. This is the story of the Thin Red Line. To understand how these few hundred men found themselves as the last hope of an empire, you must first understand the vast, complex, and grinding gears of geopolitics that had dragged them to this desolate peninsula. The Crimean War was not a simple conflict. It was not a war for territory, not really. It was the violent, inevitable eruption of a decades-long Cold War that had simmered between the two great expansionist powers of the 19th century, the maritime, liberal, and industrial British Empire, and the terrestrial, autocratic, and feudal Russian Empire. The contest was known to the spies, diplomats, and statesmen of the day as the Great Game. At its heart lay a fundamental, sprawling problem: the slow, agonizing, and seemingly irreversible collapse of the Ottoman Empire. This was not a state in decline. It was an empire in a state of advanced decay. Sprawling from the Balkans to the Persian Gulf, from North Africa to the Caucasus, The Ottoman state was derisively known in the drawing rooms of London and Paris as the sick man of Europe. For centuries, it had been a dominant power, the terror of Christendom, its armies hammering at the gates of Vienna. But by the mid-19th century, it was crumbling from within. It was plagued by systemic corruption, crippled by internal revolts from nationalist movements in Greece and the Balkans, and utterly incapable of the industrial and financial modernization that was transforming Western Europe. This power vacuum terrified the great powers, but for very different reasons. For Great Britain, the Ottoman Empire was a crucial, if distasteful, buffer. Britain was a global maritime and colonial power, a whale whose existence depended on the open sea. Its entire economy, its entire self-image, was built on its trade routes to its crown jewel, India. The overland route through the Middle East, and more importantly, the sea route through the eastern Mediterranean and toward the Suez, were paramount. If Russia, Britain's great terrestrial rival, the Bear, were to gain control of the Ottoman capital, Constantinople, it would change the world. To control Constantinople was to control the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, the narrow strategic straits that locked the powerful Russian Black Sea fleet away from the warm waters of the Mediterranean. A Russian fleet loose in the Mediterranean, with access to naval bases in the Levant and North Africa, would be a dagger pointed at the throat of the British Empire. Thus, British policy under successive governments was simple: preserve the Ottoman Empire at all costs. Prop up the sick man, however sick he might be, to keep the gates locked against the Tsar. For France, now under the ambitious and unsteady hand of Emperor Napoleon III, the nephew of the great Bonaparte, the situation was one of prestige. Napoleon III had come to power not by inheritance but by a coup d'état. He ruled a restless France and desperately needed military glory and international standing to legitimize his new imperial regime. He saw himself as a statesman, a shaper of a new Europe, and inserting France into the Eastern question was his route to relevance. He also resurrected an ancient French claim, that of being the great protector of the Catholic minorities within the Ottoman Empire. It was a useful lever of influence. And then there was Russia. Under Emperor Nicholas I, Russia was a colossal, enigmatic power. Nicholas was an autocrat's autocrat, the gendarme of Europe, who had famously crushed the Hungarian Revolution of 1848. He despised the liberalism and constitutionalism bubbling in the West. He ruled over an empire of serfs, and he saw himself and his nation as the Third Rome. He was the inheritor of Byzantine glory and the rightful, holy protector of all Orthodox Christians. Millions of these Orthodox subjects lived under the rule of the Ottoman Sultan. Nicholas saw their liberation as his holy and historic mission. But mixed with this religious zeal was a cold, pragmatic, and centuries-old hunger for expansion. Nicholas wanted what every Tsar since Peter the Great had lusted after, a warm water port, untroubled by ice. He wanted access to the Mediterranean. He wanted dominance over the Black Sea. The sick man was dying, and Nicholas intended to be the primary beneficiary of his will, to finally seize the inheritance of Constantinople. The spark that lit this global powder keg was, almost absurdly, a dispute over a set of keys. In 1850, a squabble, more of a brawl, broke out between Catholic and Orthodox monks in Bethlehem over who had the right to hold the keys to the Church of the Nativity's main door. They also fought over who had the right to place a silver star over the grotto alleged to be Christ's birthplace. It was a petty theological turf war. But Napoleon III, eager to flex his muscles and curry favor with the Catholic party in France, backed the Catholic claim. Nicholas I, seeing this as a French incursion into his spiritual sphere, was outraged. He backed the Orthodox claim. The Ottoman Sultan, Abdul-Mejid I, was caught in the middle. He was a weak, well-intentioned reformer, and he waffled, first promising the French, then the Russians. In 1853, Nicholas, feeling the British were distracted and the French were posturing, saw his opening. He sent a blunt and aggressive diplomat, Prince Menshikov, to Constantinople with an ultimatum. The demand was simple. Russia must be recognized as the formal protector of all 10 million Orthodox subjects in the Ottoman Empire. This was a diplomatic Trojan horse. To grant it would be to give Russia a permanent, legal justification to interfere in Ottoman internal affairs. It would make the Tsar a co-sovereign within the Sultan's own borders. The Sultan, bolstered by the quiet but steely promises of support from the formidable British ambassador, Lord Stratford de Redcliffe, refused. Nicholas, enraged by this defiance, ordered his armies to occupy the Danubian principalities, modern-day Romania, which were then under Ottoman suzerainty. It was an act of blatant aggression. The complex clockwork of alliances began to tick. The British, seeing the Russian bear finally on the move, sent the Royal Navy to the mouth of the Dardanelles. The French, not to be outdone, followed. A frantic, final series of diplomatic notes flew between the European capitals, but it was too late. In October 1853, the Ottomans, feeling emboldened by the Western fleets, declared war on Russia. The first major clash of this war was a catastrophe that sealed the fate of Europe. The Russian Black Sea Fleet, under Admiral Nakhimov, caught a squadron of the inferior Ottoman navy at anchor in the port of Sinope on the southern coast of the Black Sea. What followed was not a battle. It was an execution. The Russian ships were equipped with a devastating new technology, Paishan's guns, which fired explosive shells, not solid cannonballs. The wooden Turkish frigates were systematically blown apart, set ablaze, and sunk. Over 3,000 Turkish sailors were killed. When news of the massacre of Sinope reached London and Paris, it was portrayed in the press as a barbaric atrocity, a massacre of a brave ally. Public opinion, already stoked by jingoistic newspapers, swung violently toward war. In London, Lord Palmerston, the aggressive Home Secretary, who believed in projecting British power, saw his moment. The Prime Minister, Lord Aberdeen, a cautious man who had desperately sought peace, was overruled and outmaneuvered. The press, particularly the Times of London, thundered for a decisive blow against Russian expansionism. In March of 1854, Great Britain and France declared war on Russia. An alliance of the two great Western European rivals, who had spent the better part of 500 years trying to destroy each other, was now a reality. They had gone to war to save an Islamic empire they both disdained from a Christian empire they both feared. The initial Allied plan was logical, if simplistic. Boot the Russians out of the Danubian principalities. An expeditionary force of British and French troops was assembled and landed at Varna in modern standard Bulgaria. And there, the war effort began, not with a bang, but with a horrifying whimper. The army was not prepared for an industrial campaign. The logistics were a nightmare, but worse than the logistics was the water. Cholera, the great 19th century plague, ripped through the camps. Men died in agony, dehydrated and hollowed out within hours. The army was rotting from the inside before it had even seen a Russian soldier. Then, the entire strategic purpose of the expedition evaporated. The Russians, facing diplomatic pressure from a neutral and threatening Austria on their flank, strategically withdrew from the principalities. Suddenly, the Allies had a massive, disease-ridden army on the Black Sea coast with no one to fight. But they couldn't just go home. Public opinion, which had been so instrumental in starting the war, demanded a victory. The press demanded blood. Napoleon III needed his gloire. The British government needed to justify the expense and the deaths from disease. And so, a new target was chosen, one that had been in the back of British naval planners' minds for years. Sevastopol. Sevastopol on the Crimean Peninsula was the jewel of Russian naval power. It was their main, heavily fortified naval base in the Black Sea, the home of the fleet that had destroyed Sinope. The thinking was simple. If Sevastopol falls, the Russian threat in the Black Sea is neutralized for a generation. The bear's claws would be clipped. And so, in September 1854, a vast armada of British, French, and Turkish ships crossed the Black Sea and landed an army of over 60,000 men on the beaches of Calamita Bay. They were utterly, appallingly unprepared. They had no good maps of the terrain. They had little intelligence on Russian strength. They had no transport to carry their supplies. They had no medical equipment to speak of. Cholera, which had ravaged them at Varna, followed them on the ships. Men died in agony on the beaches, their first steps on enemy soil. This army was a strange, paradoxical mix of the ancient and the modern. It was led by men who were, almost to a one, relics of a bygone era. The British commander was Lord Raglan. He was 66 years old. He was a man of unquestionable, almost serene personal bravery. He had, after all, served as the military secretary and aide-de-camp to the Duke of Wellington himself, losing an arm at the Iron Duke's side at Waterloo, but he had not commanded troops in the field for 40 years. He was an aristocrat, part of a system where commissions, the right to command a regiment, were bought and sold like property. This system promoted wealth and social connection over merit. He was so steeped in the Napoleonic Wars, his entire frame of reference, that he was infamously heard to refer to the enemy as the French, before his staff gently corrected him. His French counterpart, Marshal Saint-Arnaud, was a dashing veteran of the brutal French wars in Algeria. But he was also a dying man, his command crippled by the agonizing pain of stomach cancer. The command of the British Cavalry, the elite of the army, was a case study in aristocratic dysfunction. It was led by the Earl of Lucan, a bitter, pedantic, and unpopular man who had bought his way to high command. Lucan, in turn, despised his brother-in-law, the man who led the elite Light Brigade, James Brudenell, the 7th Earl of Cardigan. Cardigan was a man of spectacular arrogance, notorious throughout England. He was famous for spending £10,000 a year of his own money, a king's ransom, on magnificent, gold-laced uniforms for his regiment, the 11th Hussars. He was equally famous for his explosive temper, his persecution of his own officers. One black bottle affair over wine at mess had become a national scandal, and his treatment of his men as his personal property. He saw war as a glorious game, a stage for aristocratic gallantry, and he had spent the voyage to Crimea living on his private yacht, drinking champagne. These men, Raglan, Lucan, and Cardigan, were the army of the past. But the men they commanded, the common infantrymen, the Tommies, carried the weapon of the future. The British infantryman, the common soldier who had enlisted for a shilling a day, was no longer armed with the Brown Bess. That was the smooth-bore musket that had won Waterloo. It was, in essence, a small, inaccurate shotgun. It fired a round lead ball down a smooth barrel. The ball bounced its way out, making it wildly inaccurate beyond 75 or perhaps 100 yards. Napoleonic battles were won by firing massive, disciplined volleys at close range, a wall of lead that was more statistical than precise. The British soldier in the Crimea was equipped with the Patton 1853 Enfield rifle musket. This was a 5-foot-long revolution in steel and wood. The Enfield was a rifle. Its barrel was precisely grooved with rifling that spun the bullet as it exited. And the bullet itself was a technological marvel, the Minier ball invented by a French army captain. This was not a ball at all, but a conical lead bullet with a hollow base. When the rifle was fired, the explosion of gunpowder violently expanded the soft lead base, forcing it to grip the rifling tightly. This spin stabilized the bullet, making it stable in flight, accurate and deadly at ranges that were previously unthinkable for a common infantryman. 500, 600, even 800 yards. A single, well-trained, disciplined soldier with an Enfield could now do the work of 10 with muskets. He could engage the enemy long before they could engage him. He could break artillery crews by picking them off from afar. He could destroy officer formations, and most importantly, he could shatter a cavalry charge before it even got close. The Russians, by and large, were still armed with smoothbore muskets. Their tactics were based on the bayonet charge, on sheer mass and holy courage. The Allies, particularly the British, had a technological advantage they did not yet fully understand, but they would learn. On September 20th, 1854, the Allies marched south toward Sevastopol and found the Russian army under Prince Menshikov dug in on the heights above the Alma River. The battle that followed was a bloody, chaotic, and revealing mess. The British, in their parade ground formations, their officers demanding perfect lines, marched directly into the teeth of Russian artillery fire. Brigades wavered and broke. The French, in a more flexible formation, struggled up the steep cliffs on the Russian flank. Lord Raglan, in a moment of bizarre, courageous confusion, rode so far forward with his staff looking for a good vantage point that he actually ended up behind the Russian lines. Undisturbed, he had a cannon brought up and personally began directing fire onto the Russian reserves, creating chaos. The sheer, stubborn grit of the British infantry and the terrifying long-range power of their new rifles eventually won the day. The Russians, shocked by the range and accuracy of the British fire, broke and fled in a rout back to Sevastopol. The Allies had their victory. It was a bloody one, and here, the campaign stalled. This was the moment of decision. The Allies could have marched directly into Sevastopol. The city was in a panic, its landward defenses incomplete, its army demoralized. A swift, brutal assault would likely have taken the city and ended the war in a month. But the aging, cautious commanders hesitated. They feared a trap. They were men of the 18th century, trained in the slow, methodical, and gentlemanly art of siege warfare. They decided against a direct assault and instead opted for a long, formal siege. This decision was catastrophic. It was the single worst decision of the war. It doomed the Allied armies to a winter in the trenches. It was a winter they were not equipped for, a winter of cold, starvation, typhus, and dysentery that would kill far, far more men than any Russian cannon. To conduct the siege, the Allies had to march around the city to its south side, where the ground was better for siege works. The French army, larger and better organized, took the port of Camish as their supply base. The British, in a fateful move, were allocated the small, rocky, and utterly inadequate fishing harbor of Balaclava. This port, Balaclava, became the single point of failure for the entire British army. It was a tiny, narrow inlet, a bottleneck choked with ships. Everything the army needed to survive, every bullet, every biscuit, every blanket, every cannonball, every medical bandage, had to be landed at this one small quay and then hauled 6 miles up a steep, muddy, and soon-to-be impassable track to the siege lines around Sevastopol. If Balaclava fell, the British army would be cut off. It would starve. The siege would collapse. The war would be lost. The Russians, now commanded by Prince Menshikov from within Sevastopol, understood this perfectly. He had been reinforced. He saw the vulnerability, and so he gathered a force of 25,000 men and, on October 25th, launched a massive, well-planned assault with one simple objective: capture Balaclava and destroy the British. The British defenses for their vital port were, almost criminally, weak. Lord Raglan, fixated on the siege of Sevastopol, had left his supply base dangerously exposed. The main defense consisted of a string of small, weak hilltop forts, or redoubts, built on a rise called the Causeway Heights. This ridge split the valley in two, and these redoubts were not manned by British troops. They were manned by 3,000 Ottoman Turks. They were brave men, veterans of other conflicts, but the British command, steeped in colonial prejudice, openly and unfairly disdained them as cowardly and unreliable. Crucially, they were armed only with old, useless, smoothbore muskets. In overall command of Balaclava's defense was one of the few truly professional, battle-hardened soldiers in the entire British Army, Sir Colin Campbell. Campbell was everything Raglan and Cardigan were not. He was 61 years old, the son of a Glasgow carpenter named John MacIver. He had taken his mother's name, Campbell, to join the army. He had not bought his commission. He had earned it, fighting his way up the ranks through sheer, undeniable merit and ferocious courage. He was a veteran of Wellington's Peninsular War, the War of 1812 in America, wars in China, and brutal frontier campaigns in India. He was tough, pragmatic, famously short-tempered, and loved by his men, who affectionately called him the Old Brute. He understood his soldiers, and they trusted him implicitly. He had been given command of the Highland Brigade, a force that included the 93rd Sutherland Highlanders. The 93rd were a breed apart, recruited largely from the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. They were known for their fierce discipline, their tall, imposing stature, and their stern, almost fanatical Presbyterian faith. They were so renowned for their piety, holding regular prayer meetings and shunning the army's endemic vice of drunkenness, that they were nicknamed the Praying Regiment. But their piety hid a warrior's spirit, forged in the hard-scrabble life of the Highlands. There was a dark irony to their service. Many were the sons of families cleared from the Sutherland estates to make way for sheep, now fighting in a regiment named for the very family that had evicted them. They were professionals, and like Campbell, they were armed with the Enfield rifle. As dawn broke on October 25th, the Russian plan unfolded with textbook precision. A massive, coordinated artillery bombardment opened up on the Turkish-held redoubts on the Causeway Heights. The Turks, armed only with muskets that had a maximum range of 100 yards, had no effective way to fire back. The Russian guns were 1,000 yards away, pounding them with impunity. Then the Russian infantry advanced. Waves of grey-coated soldiers swarmed up the hills. The Ottoman soldiers fought bravely, holding their ground against impossible odds. But they were outnumbered, outgunned, and utterly exposed. One by one, the redoubts were overwhelmed in a tide of Russian infantry and bayonets. The Turks who survived broke and fled, streaming down the hillsides, toward Balaclava, a panicked rout streaming past the British positions. The British officers, watching from their saddles, reacted with contempt. "The damned Turks are running," was the cry. They failed to see the obvious. The Turks had been left in an impossible position, asked to hold a vital line with obsolete weapons against a modern army, and had held it as long as any men could. Their rout, however, was a tactical disaster. The Causeway Heights were now in Russian hands. The valley was open. The British naval guns in the redoubts were captured. It was a complete Russian victory. And then things began to go wrong for the Russians. General Rizhov, commanding the main cavalry force of some 3,000 hussars, lancers, and Cossacks, crested the ridge. He saw the Allied camp in disarray. He decided to press his advantage, to sweep down and destroy the remaining infantry and capture the port. He wheeled his massive formation and began to move down the slope of the North Valley. But something was left. Moving to intercept him in a magnificent, glittering formation of bright red tunics and shining helmets was the British Heavy Brigade, led by General James Scarlett. Scarlett was another old commander, 65 years old, but he was a fighter. He saw the Russian tidal wave. He had at his disposal only 800 men. The textbook move, the sensible move, was to retreat, to reform, to wait for support. Scarlett, in a moment of pure, instinctive, and glorious aggression, did the opposite. He ordered his bugler to sound the charge. What happened next was one of the most astonishing and successful cavalry charges in history, one completely overshadowed by the two that would follow. 800 British heavy dragoons on huge, powerful charger horses wheeled and charged uphill into the center of 3,000 Russian cavalry. The Russians, stunned by the sheer audacity of this tiny force attacking them, made a fatal error. They stopped. Their momentum was lost. They sat at a halt, waiting for the impact. The heavy brigade, in a perfect, disciplined wedge, smashed into their front line like a freight train. A brutal, swirling, hacking melee of sabers and screaming horses erupted. The British dragoons, better trained in swordsmanship and on heavier, more powerful horses, began to cut their way through the much larger, but now confused and static, Russian mass. For 10 minutes, it was a savage brawl. Then the unthinkable happened. The Russian cavalry broke. The 3,000-strong force, having been frontally assaulted by 800 men, turned and retreated in disorder back over the ridge. The heavy brigade had won a stunning textbook victory, and almost no one in command saw it. Lord Cardigan, with his entire light brigade, sat on his horse a few hundred yards away and refused to charge the Russian flank, claiming his orders were to defend the position, not to attack. He watched, immobile, as his hated brother-in-law, Lucan, fought for his life. High above, Lord Raglan, watching from his headquarters on the Sapune Heights, a 600-foot cliff overlooking the whole valley, was furious. From his godlike vantage point, he could see the Russians regrouping. He could see them preparing to drag away the captured British guns from the redoubts. To a man of his time, losing your artillery to the enemy was the ultimate, unforgivable disgrace. He began to dictate a series of vague, frantic, and increasingly angry orders. Meanwhile, down in the valley, Sir Colin Campbell was facing a new, more immediate, and more terrifying crisis. While the main Russian cavalry force had been repulsed by Scarlet, a smaller but still powerful detachment of around 400 to 600 hussars, under a different commander, had broken off from the main attack. They had not engaged the heavy brigade. They had a different objective. They were riding hard, not for the British cavalry, but for the port of Balaclava itself. Campbell looked around. The heavy brigade was reforming, exhausted and bloody, unusable. The light brigade was sitting idle, a mile away. The fleeing Turks were in chaos. He had at his disposal the 93rd Highlanders, all 550 of them. He was also joined by a handful of invalids from other regiments, men too sick to fight in the siege lines, but too stubborn to go to the hospital, and, crucially, about 100 of the rallied Turkish soldiers who formed up beside the Highlanders. In total, he had perhaps 700 men. The Russian cavalry was thundering toward him. The standard, unchangeable, 100% by-the-book military doctrine for infantry facing a cavalry charge was simple. Form a square. A square was a human fortress. Men formed a tight, four-sided box, ranks deep, with a hedge of bayonets pointing outward. A horse cannot charge a solid wall of steel. The cavalry would be forced to circle the square, disorganized and vulnerable, while the infantry fired controlled volleys into them at point-blank range. But Campbell had a problem. He looked at the ground he had to defend, a wide, open gap between two hills. He looked at his 550 Highlanders. He did not have enough men to form a square and cover the ground. A square would be too small. The cavalry would simply laugh, ride around it on either side, and be in Balaclava in minutes, slashing, burning, and capturing the port. He had to cover the gap. So Sir Colin Campbell, the old professional, the son of a carpenter, made a decision that must have seemed like suicidal madness to every other officer on the field. He ordered his men to deploy, not in a square, but in a line. A long, thin, fragile line, just 2 men deep. He rode his horse, old Donald, out in front of them, a single, defiant figure. The men fixed bayonets. The long, triangular blades snapped onto the muzzles of their Enfields with a sharp, metallic sound. They checked the arm percussion caps on their rifles. They stood, shoulder to shoulder, a 500-yard-long, 6-foot-deep ribbon of red wool and steel. The Russian hussars, coming on at a canter, saw this. To them, it must have been a joke, a glorious gift. A line, too deep. A single, determined charge would slice through that like paper. They expected the line to fire one panicked, inaccurate, smoothbore volley, and then break and run. This was not a fight. This was a pursuit. Campbell, calm, rode down the line, his voice clear. He knew his men. He knew their Highland temper, their stubbornness, and their unique discipline. He gave them their orders. They were not to fire until he gave the command. They were to hold, no matter what. Then, in a moment that would be immortalized, he is said to have shouted the most famous words of his career. "Men, remember there is no retreat from here. You must die where you stand." A young officer nearby, John Scots, supposedly replied with grim Highland understatement, "Aye, aye, Sir Colin, we'll do that." The ground began to tremble. The sound of the hooves became a deafening, visceral roar. The Russian cavalry, now just 600 yards away, lowered their lances and drew their curved sabers. The charge began. Imagine standing in that line. You can smell the sweat and the damp wool of the man next to you. You can see the individual faces of the men thundering toward you, their mouths open, screaming a battle cry. You can see the foam on their horses' mouths. Every instinct in your body, every primal urge for survival is screaming at you to turn, to run, to find cover. But the 93rd did not run. They stood. Campbell, on his horse, was the measure. He waited. The Russians were coming on, faster now, a wall of flesh and steel. 600 yards. This was the moment. This was the precise moment the new technology truly mattered. In the Napoleonic Wars, at this range, the Highlanders would have been little more than spectators, waiting for the inevitable. But they held Enfields. "Ready!" 550 rifles were brought to the shoulder. "Present!" 550 hammers were cocked back, the click lost in the thunder of hooves. "Fire!" A single, crashing, disciplined volley ripped down the line. A cloud of acrid white-black smoke, smelling of sulphur, instantly obscured the world, and through the smoke came the screams, not just of men, but the high-pitched, terrible screams of horses. The Minier balls, accurate even at this extreme range, tore into the front rank of the charge. Horses somersaulted, throwing their riders. Men were thrown clear, their bodies tumbling like dolls. The charge, shocked at taking effective, deadly fire so early, visibly faltered. The front line collapsed, and the ranks behind began to pile into them, a scene of chaos and confusion. But they were cavalry. They were brave. They reformed, spurred their horses over and around their fallen comrades, and came on again. The Highlanders, in a miracle of disciplined training, were already reloading. In a pre-modern battle, this was the moment cavalry would win. The infantry, having fired their one shot, would be helpless for the 30 seconds it took to reload. But the Enfield was faster, and the 93rd were professionals. Tar cartridge with teeth. Pour powder down the muzzle. Ram ball and wadding. Place percussion cap on the nipple. The Russians were closer now, 350 yards. They were coming on again. "Ready! Present! Fire!" The second volley was even more devastating. It hit the massed cavalry at a range where it was still too far for them to fight, but perfect for the rifles. More horses, more men went down. The charge was no longer a charge. It was a staggered, confused, and bleeding mess. The Russian officers could be seen frantically trying to wheel their men, to restore order, to get them to face this wall of smoke and death. But the discipline of the line was greater than the discipline of the mob. And then, a small crisis. On the right flank of the line, a group of Highlanders, their blood up, their Highland spirit taking over, began to surge forward, breaking formation, eager to get at the enemy with their bayonets. It was this eagerness that could destroy them. A broken line is a dead line. Campbell, whose horse was shot from under him at this very moment, got to his feet and roared out a command that became as famous as the battle itself. 93rd, 93rd, damn all that eagerness. The officers, using their swords and their voices, beat the men back into line. The formation held. It was, perhaps, the most critical moment of the fight. The Russians saw it. They saw the line waver, and then they saw it hold. They were now just 150 yards away, but their charge was completely broken. They were taking casualties, their momentum was gone, and the line in front of them had not flinched. It remained a solid wall of fire and steel. It was impossible. It was unnatural. They wheeled. The entire formation of hussars, hundreds of them, turned their horses and fled back up the valley, disappearing into the smoke, a beaten, shattered force. The Highlanders, in a sudden release of impossible tension, let out a massive, primal cheer. It was over in minutes. The impossible had happened. 550 infantrymen, in a line 2 deep, had faced a massed cavalry charge and broken it with rifle fire alone. Not a single Russian saber had reached the line. Not a single Highlander had been wounded by cavalry. They had, quite literally, died where they stood. Watching from the cliffs 600 feet above, his telescope pressed to his eye, was a man who would change warfare as much as the Enfield rifle. William Howard Russell, a correspondent for the Times of London. He was, in effect, the world's first modern war correspondent, and his dispatches were electrified. He scribbled furiously in his notebook, describing the scene. He saw the 93rd, far below, as a thin red streak tipped with a line of steel. When it was printed in London, weeks later, the line was paraphrased by his editor. It became the Thin Red Line. A legend was born. The battle, however, was far from over. The stand of the 93rd was just the second act of a 3-act tragedy. The third act would become the most famous, the most glorious, and the most pointless in military history. Lord Raglan, still watching from the cliffs, was incandescent with rage. The Russians were getting away, and worse, they were still in possession of the redoubts, and they were bringing up horses to drag his captured British guns away. He turned to an aide, General Airey, and dictated a new, fatally ambiguous order for his cavalry commander, the Earl of Lucan. Lord Raglan wishes the cavalry to advance rapidly to the front, follow the enemy, and try to prevent the enemy carrying away the guns. Troop horse artillery may accompany. French cavalry is on your left. Immediate. The order was given to Captain Lewis Nolan, a brilliant but rash and arrogant cavalry officer. Nolan was one of the few who believed cavalry could beat artillery. He also openly held the cautious Lord Lucan in contempt. He galloped down the steep cliffs and delivered the written order to Lucan. Lucan read it. He was perplexed. Advance rapidly to the front. What front? The heavy brigade had just cleared the front. Prevent the enemy carrying away the guns. What guns? From Lucan's position in the valley, he could not see the redoubts on the causeway heights where the captured British guns were. The terrain obscured them. The only guns he could see were a different set entirely, a full, active battery of Russian artillery at the very end of the other valley, the North Valley, 1.5 miles away. These guns were protected by Russian cannons and infantry on both flanks. Lucan asked Nolan, "What guns, sir?" Nolan, in a fatal fit of pique, instead of clarifying, gestured with a wide, contemptuous sweep of his arm. He did not point to the redoubts. He pointed vaguely toward the end of the long, wrong valley. "There, my lord, is your enemy. There are your guns." Lucan, insulted by Nolan's tone and bound by the written order from his commander, felt he had no choice. He turned to the Earl of Cardigan, his hated brother-in-law, who had been sitting with his magnificent light brigade fuming at having missed the action. Lucan, with cold formality, gave him the order, "Advance down the valley." Cardigan, to his credit, saw the madness of it. He looked down the mile-long valley. He saw the Russian guns at the end. He saw the Russian infantry on the Fedyukin heights to his left. He saw the Russians with his captured British guns on the causeway heights to his right. It was a perfect, U-shaped killing field. He saluted and replied, "Certainly, sir, but allow me to point out to you that the Russians have a battery in our front and batteries and riflemen on both our flanks." Lucan replied with a fatalistic shrug, "I know it, but Lord Raglan will have it. We have no choice but to obey." Cardigan turned to his 673 men of the Light Brigade, the Lancers, the Hussars, the Light Dragoons. He drew his sabre. He was, if nothing else, impossibly brave. "The brigade will advance." And so the Light Brigade, in perfect parade ground formation, as if they were in Hyde Park, began to move. First at a walk, then a trot, then a canter. They rode, not into glory, but into a meat grinder. They rode into what Alfred, Lord Tennyson, would read in Russell's dispatches and immortalize as the Valley of Death. They were cannonaded from the front. They were cannonaded from the left. They were cannonaded from the right. The air filled with iron. Men and horses were blown to pieces. Captain Nolan, who had delivered the order and was riding with the charge, was one of the first to die, a shell fragment tearing open his chest, his body letting out an unearthly shriek as his horse carried it, dead, back through the line. But they did not stop. This was the other side of aristocratic leadership. Not professionalism, but a fatal, magnificent, and utterly pointless bravery. They accelerated into the jaws of death. They reached the Russian guns at the end of the valley. They sabred the gunners. They were a shattered, bleeding, disorganized remnant, now trapped behind enemy lines. They turned and tried to ride back. The slaughter was repeated. Of the 673 men who rode down the valley, 278 were killed, wounded, or captured. Nearly 500 horses were lost. They had achieved nothing. They had not recaptured the guns. They had not broken the Russian line. They had simply, bravely, and stupidly died, all because of a feud between two aristocrats and a vague order from another. The Battle of Balaclava was over. It was a tactical mess. The Russians had failed to take the port, but they had captured the redoubts and the British guns, which they kept. The British had held the port, but at the cost of shattering their elite cavalry force. The day had seen 3 separate, iconic cavalry actions, each a perfect symbol of a different aspect of war. First, there was the charge of the Heavy Brigade, a stunning success of professional, disciplined, and aggressive shock tactics. It was a victory won by the old rules, a perfect Napoleonic charge. And it was almost immediately forgotten, overshadowed by what came next. Second, there was the charge of the Light Brigade, a disaster born of aristocratic rivalry, unclear orders, and a total disregard for the new realities of the battlefield. It was a testament to the undeniable bravery of the soldier and the criminal incompetence of the command. It was a medieval charge, and it died a modern death. And for its very tragedy, its glorious failure, it became immortal. And third, there was the thin red line. This was something different. This was the future. It was not a charge, but a stand. It was not a success of the old rules, but a brutal, definitive demonstration of the new rules. It was the moment the balance of power between cavalry and infantry, which had held for centuries, definitively and finally tipped. What the 93rd Highlanders achieved was a tactical revolution. They proved, beyond all doubt, that a disciplined line of infantry, armed with modern, rapid-firing rifles, could stop a massed cavalry charge dead in its tracks, long before it ever became a melee. The Enfield rifle had made the infantry square obsolete. It had, in 10 minutes, made the massed cavalry charge a suicidal relic. The horse and saber, the tools of war for 1,000 years, the symbol of the mounted knight and the dashing hussar, had just been rendered useless by the rifled barrel and the minier ball. The age of firepower had begun. So, did this impossible stand change history, as the title claims? In the grand, strategic sense of the Crimean War, no. The Battle of Balaclava did not end the war. The 93rd did not march on Sevastopol. The bloody, miserable siege would grind on for another terrible year. The Allied armies would be devastated by a far more lethal enemy, the Crimean Winter. This is the war's dark secret. The battles were footnotes. The real enemy was the weather and the supply chain. Men would freeze to death in the trenches, still wearing the thin summer uniforms they had landed in. Horses, which were needed to carry food and ammunition up from Balaclava, starved to death by the thousands, eating their own manes and tails before collapsing in the 6-mile river of mud. The supply system at Balaclava, which the 93rd had saved, collapsed under the strain of incompetence and weather, creating a medical and logistical nightmare. The port was a floating mass of frozen carcasses and discarded equipment. It would take the reports of William Howard Russell, the man who named the Thin Red Line, to change that. His dispatches were not just about glory. They were filled with raw, uncensored, and furious descriptions of the suffering, the cholera, the frostbite, the lack of food, the criminal absence of medical care, the wounded men left to lie in their own filth. These reports, published in the Times, scandalized Victorian England. The public, who had cheered the Thin Red Line, was now horrified by the incompetence that surrounded it. The public outcry he generated directly forced the government to act. It led directly to Florence Nightingale being sent to the hospitals at Scutari, where she would wage her own war, not against the Russians, but against filth, disease, and bureaucratic indifference. She would revolutionize nursing and sanitation, saving thousands. In this, the Thin Red Line was a catalyst. It was the good news in a dispatch full of horror, a story of heroism that made the public listen. And, in listening, they learned of the incompetence, and in learning, they demanded change. But the stand's true, lasting legacy is tactical. Balaclava as a whole, from the triumph of the heavies to the tragedy of the Light Brigade, and most especially the stand of the Highlanders, was the death knell of cavalry as the dominant shock-and-awe force on the battlefield. The American Civil War, less than a decade later, would confirm it on a monstrous scale, as massed infantry with rifles would slaughter cavalry formations time and again. Pickett's charge at Gettysburg was the infantry equivalent, a futile, heroic assault against a line of men with rifles. The future of war, the future that the Thin Red Line predicted, would be decided by trenches, by barbed wire, by machine guns, and by long-range artillery, all things that grew from the seed of long-range, rapid-fire infantry dominance proven by the 93rd. Sir Colin Campbell, the carpenter's son, would become a national hero, eventually receiving a peerage as Lord Clyde. He, not the aristocrats, was the model of the modern general. The 93rd Highlanders would go on to fight with equal distinction in the Indian Mutiny, part of another Thin Red Line that retook Lucknow. But the image that endures, the one captured by the painter Robert Gibb, is that of those 550 men standing too deep in the cold Crimean mist, their rifles blazing. It became a symbol, a national myth for the British Empire. The idea of the stoic, professional, working-class soldier holding the line against overwhelming odds, a bastion of discipline against a barbarian horde. It became an ideal of courage, of dying where you stand. Today, the valley is quiet. The redoubts are little more than mounds of earth, but the story remains, a story far more complex than just a moment of bravery. It is a story about the end of an era and the brutal, smoky birth of another. It is a story of how 550 men, armed with a new technology, led by a man who trusted them and abandoned by commanders who failed them, held the line between one age of warfare and the next. And in doing so, they passed into legend.